when we look closer at the self, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of aspects to the self that are very important. So we've looked at how it changes throughout age, how different topics relate to it, but we haven't identified two of the key concepts within the self, and that's the concept of the identity and the concept of personality. Well, in this first half of this second section, we're going to be focusing in on this concept of identity, the complete description of who we actually are. And when we talk about identity, what we see when a person really describes their essence is that it can come in a number of different forms. There's a lot of different things that define us, define who we are. So we can look at things like your work or the things that you're tending to pursue, your ideologies, maybe your political leanings, your past relationships, your friends. All of these things really encapsulate yourself, and sometimes, it encapsulates in addition your identity. And sometimes this identity might be really hard to articulate, but when we have an identity, even if we can't articulate it, we kind of know who we actually are. So we know who we aren't as well. And we also can see, when we look at identities, that there's a lot of variation from person to person. And that variation is what we can use to really pick up on our true identity, our true sense of self that we're looking at. But what we haven't covered when we look at this identity is where this perception actually forms. And what we're going to do in this first section is talk about how identity actually comes up as we age. But before we talk about where this idea of identity comes before we age, what we should do is probably talk about how identity challenges actually come, or how we're kind of brought to study this idea of identity. And when we look at this question of identity, where it's coming from, what we usually have to do is acknowledge one specific researcher within the field of psychology. This man was named Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson was kind of the pioneer in research of identity and where it came from for a very specific reason. Erik Erikson, pictured in the upper right-hand corner, was born in Germany in 1902, and he had a rather tumultuous upbringing that kind of brought him to really study and focus on identity. In particular, he was born to a very Norwegian family, so he had kind of a Swiss upbringing, and you can see by his blonde hair, which was even blonder apparently when he was young, and he had very Norwegian characteristics. So he was tall, kind of muscular with tan skin, and this kind of physical characteristic caused him to identify very much with his Norwegian mother and kind of his Norwegian upbringing from his father. But at a young age, he was actually abandoned by this father, and his mother eventually remarried a Jewish man, and his father adopted him, or his new father adopted him, and he was then moved with his mother to a Jewish community. And when he got to this Jewish community, he was really presented with a lot of challenges, in particular challenges to his identity, because he was kind of considered an outcast in multiple areas of his life. When hanging out with his friends in the Jewish community, a lot of times they would pick on him or ostracize him because he didn't look like them. And he didn't really fit their requirements to fit in or to hang out with that particular group, in particular because of his Nordic appearance. But at school, a private school that he went to that was away from his Jewish community, he was also ostracized, in particular, or in part, for being Jewish and being raised in a Jewish community, because when he was adopted by his Jewish stepfather, that was the religion that his family chose to pursue. And those kind of instances of being ostracized in both points of his life caused Erikson to really struggle to understand who he actually was. And as a result of this teasing, or at least we believe that as a result of this teasing, Erikson kind of set out in his life to try to understand where these challenges come from and why children and adults really obsessed with this concept of identity and this idea of who we actually are. After studying a number of people on this concept of identity, Erikson came to believe that when we progress throughout our life, we're actually going through what he called stages of development that relate to identity. In essence, what he argued was that in each stage of our life, we have a very specific conflict and question that we're asking. And the answer that we get to that question shapes our perspective of who we are and our overall identity. In infancy, he said that one of the big things that children struggle with, one of the first identity crises that they run into, is this question of whether or not they can trust their environment. Am I a person that's trusting, or am I a person that's not going to be capable of trusting anything? Obviously, infants can't articulate this, but he argues that when they come to a conclusion of whether or not they can trust their world, this idea, this perspective, is something that's carried over to the rest of their lives. So if a young infant isn't breastfed enough, isn't cared for, isn't kind of nurtured when it's crying, then Erikson argued that this child is going to spend the rest of their life really not trusting anybody, really not trusting anything. But if our basic needs are met, then theoretically a person learns to trust the world, trust their environment, and know that most of the world is fairly predictable. After infancy, we move on to early childhood, where we start to look at whether or not people can do things by themselves. And then we get into later childhood, where we start to wonder whether or not we're a good or a bad person. And we continue on throughout our life, asking new questions about who we are, whether or not we're of value, whether or not we want to be with people. And these questions, these overarching ideas, are said to all kind of integrate together until we get an overall sense of who we are, what our identity actually is. And each question gives us a very new insight into our personality, according to Erikson. Well, we're not sure whether or not this concept of identity really does unfold in this specific pattern, but what we do know is that our identity seems to grow as we age. Our perspective of who we are, our perspective of the things that are important to us, does seem to have an unfolding pattern that maybe doesn't mirror what Erikson originally proposed, but it does seem to kind of reflect continual stages of revelation, continual moments where a child or an adolescent or even an adult starts to really get a sense of who they actually are. And a lot of times we see that most of these realizations come from conflict or come from questions that we're usually struggling with. When we look closer at Erikson's concept of identity, we also see that he recognized that the identity process, that realization of who we are, also has a number of specific moments in our life that play another major role in our perception of identity. One of the things that Erikson recognized in his studies of identity, and we've actually been able to replicate this a number of times in research, is that in adolescence, there seems to be a very, very critical focus on who I am. And we've already talked about this earlier when we talked about this focus on the self, this tinkering with multiple selves. Well, in addition to looking at the self, so this growth in identity, this real concentrated focus of identity really seems to be the hallmark of adolescence. And as we grow in adolescence, what we see is almost an immersion of a consistent sense of identity that usually carries over into adulthood. So not only do we have a sense of self and all the different things that we are, both physically, personality-wise, and identity-wise, but that sense of identity, what we like, what we want to be, all of those things really become much more solidified as we get into adulthood. But in adolescence, that question is on the tip of our minds every single day. As we get into our later years, we also see that we start to focus on that past self, that question of who we were, what our identity was like when we get into our older years. And in fact, very often what we see is that past identity, that person we were, sometimes becomes more important than our current identity, and it's something that we usually cling to when we get into our later years. If we go back to Erikson's concept of the stages of growth, what we see in his research, and we don't really have a lot of proof of this, but what we see in Erikson's research and what he proposes in his research is that if we skip a stage of identity achievement, so if we skip answering a question, oftentimes there's problems in identity growth and personality growth as we age. Now, as I said, we don't have a lot of conclusive evidence that this is actually true, and we don't even have a lot of conclusive evidence that these questions really are in the forefront of people's mind as we get through specific stages. But according to Erikson, that skipping of an identity question, or whether or not we achieve identity at a specific stage, can really carry over into the rest of our life, and we might indeed kind of question our identity throughout our life if we don't come to resolution at the age that's appropriate for the stages of identity achievement that he stipulated. Now, as I kind of suggested there in that last little spot, even though Erikson's ideas were very interesting, and they definitely shone a light on this concept of identity, questions that we have, and this constant striving to really get a sense of who we are. A number of studies since Erikson's have really brought into question this idea of very specific patterns of growth. Most researchers nowadays believe that we're not just asking one question at each stage in our life, we're actually asking a number of questions that relate to his stages of growth. And he also argued, well, actually researchers also contended that unlike Erikson's kind of perception of things happening at specific stages, instead what we often see is that identity forms in very kind of random patterns. So we might have a critical month or a critical moment in our life that really shapes our sense of identity, not a critical stage of years that shapes our identity. And this moving, kind of erratic process of identity really never culminates at any specific point. So our sense of identity, at least what we see in research, is never really set. There's always kind of this constant transition from person to person throughout our life. But we can at least attribute the questions and this idea of identity to Erikson and his original work when we recognize how this particular aspect of the self changes with life, with our growth in life. As was mentioned earlier, when we talk about this concept of the self, there's a lot of different characteristics that make our descriptions work, that allow us to really summarize who we are. We mentioned in the very beginning of class that physical characteristics are important. We're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on them in this class. And that this idea of identity is also really critical in our ability to understand who we are. But there's one last aspect of the self that we're going to discuss before the end of class, and that's this concept of something called personality. Now, personality is different from this concept of identity because we're not talking about roles or associations or what we would like and don't like in personality. What instead we're talking about is a collection of characteristics or consistent behaviors in social situations that we typically display across a number of different situations and a number of instances that we encounter. Now, when we talk about this idea of personality, these kind of overarching trends of who we are in social situations, what we usually use to describe personality is something called traits. And these are very enduring characteristics that describe your behavior in very specific situations. So, I'm friendly is the concept of a trait. And what that means is that you're friendly not only to your dog, but you're also friendly to your neighbor. You're friendly to your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you're friendly to that person that you met on the street. And if you describe yourself as friendly, the assumption is that you're friendly most of the time, and you're friendly to a number of individuals. So there's a lot of stability across time and across situations if you're described as having a specific trait. Well, when we look at personality, when we look at stability, what we see in developmental research is even though we might describe ourselves as friendly, there's a slightly different story when we look at your actual behavior across time, when we look at your actual behavior in your traits over the years and across different situations. When we try to define what traits are, when we try to find what a consistent person is, one of the problems we've run into is how we actually define what makes you a specific person, and how we can define you with respect to other individuals. One of the problems that we run into is how many traits are actually appropriate for describing you and for describing other individuals. And within the field of personality psychology, we've had a very heated debate as to how many traits are absolutely essential to define who you are. One of the first researchers to look at traits, a man named Gordon Allport, argued that each individual has their own unique traits, their own consistent trends across situations, and that there are specific traits that emerge that are more prominent than others in those individuals. He called these traits central traits. And Gordon Allport contended that we can't ever really compare one person to another because there's different central traits for each individual. This idea of central traits that was proposed by Gordon Allport quickly became taken over by other trait theorists who argued that instead we should be able to define people's traits in a set number of terms. And one of the first persons to attempt to understand that was a man named Raymond Cattell, the man pictured in the upper far right corner. Cattell thought we actually had 16 individual characteristics that we all varied in, and we could predict your behavior, and we could summarize who you are by just looking at these 16 specific traits. He argued that these traits formed as we aged, and they changed over time. But current psychologists have come to argue that our traits, our personality, can actually be summed in about 5 different distinct personality characteristics. Call these 5 distinct personality characteristics the Big Five. What is this Big Five, and where did it come from? Well, the Big Five are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. And what Big Five personality psychologists argue is that as we're aging, as we're growing, what happens is 5 consistent trends in our personality actually emerge. Alright? Agreeableness deals with kind of our ability to be outgoing, to kind of interact with other individuals in a positive way, or if we're low in agreeableness, to kind of be in conflict with other individuals very often. So to be irritable with other people's behaviors, or kind of disrespectful of others and their desires. Extroversion dealt with either high or low ability to kind of interact with people. And what we saw in studies was that people typically fit into one or, well, actually people either felt high or low in each of the 5 categories of these particular characteristics. The question is, though, is where these Big Five actually came from. So if we're using these 5 descriptors of who you are, how did we actually get these? Is there something scientific to it, or was it just that we had 5 fingers, so we listed the 5 most important characteristics that we're interested in? Well, the way we got to the Big Five, the way we came up with descriptors of who we actually are, it was rather ingenious. So there was a man named Louis Goldberg who was trying to figure out how we could come up with descriptors of individuals, and what he sought out to do was try to find the most scientific way of defining who an individual actually is. So instead of just listing the things that he cared about, instead what he did was he went to a very, very large book called the dictionary that allowed him to find every single personality descriptor that we could possibly find in the English language. And with, I'm assuming, a lot of research assistance, he paged through the entire dictionary and actually found 18,000 words that could relate to this concept of descriptors. Unfortunately for us, Goldenberg did not stop there. What he did instead was take those 18,000 words and look for similarities and stark differences between words. So he looked for synonyms and antonyms, where synonyms being words meaning the exact same thing. So an example of this would be nice and friendly. And antonyms were words meant the exact opposite, nice and mean. And when he found these synonyms and antonyms from that list of 18,000 words, he was able to reduce those things down to just one word. So instead of just having nice, mean, and friendly, he would just have the word friendliness describing somebody's trait. And after doing this search, he was able to actually reduce the list down to 35 different traits. Actually very close to what Cattell had with his 16 characteristics. But then he further went on to do something called a factor analysis, where he would give people these 35 traits and ask them to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. And what he did with these ratings was looked for similarities. So in the trait of maybe friendliness and outgoingness, what he would do is look for whether or not everybody scoring a 10 on friendliness also scored a 10 on outgoingness. And everybody who scored an 8 on friendliness also scored an 8 on outgoingness. And everybody who scored a 1 on friendliness also scored a 1 on outgoingness. And when he found very, very high similarities between people's ratings of these terms, he came to the conclusion, through this statistical analysis, that these two terms, even though they might not in theory mean the same thing, were actually getting at the exact same personality characteristic. And because of that, he could reduce those two terms down to just one. And by doing these factor analyses with these 35 traits that he had, what he was able to do was reduce the list of personality characteristics that we were interested down to 5 personality traits. Specifically, the big 5 that we talked about earlier. So when we look at the big 5, where our personality comes from, and how we can study that with respect to development, we can see that there was a very scientific approach to acquiring it. What's interesting, though, when we look at development in the big 5, is that even though we got the big 5 through very, very good statistical approaches and a very ingenious research approach, when we compare that to development, or I guess when we apply that to development, we run into a lot of hiccups. One of the things that we see with the big 5 in age is that even though traits are meant to kind of describe our situation across our behavior across time and across situations, is that our big 5 is constantly changing as we age. It's not a huge change, but when we're young, when we're very, very young, there's a lot of fluctuation in our personality, at least the way we describe ourselves and the way others probably describe us. And then when we get into the later years, we actually have very consistent trends in our behavior across all individuals. One of the things that happens is we all become a little bit less neurotic, so less unstable, less overly emotional to everything, and we also become less open to experience as we age. Now, that doesn't mean that an extremely neurotic person is going to become perfectly normal. They're not going to just be able to handle everything, but they're going to become less neurotic than they originally were. And that doesn't mean that a person that's very open to experience is not going to be open to anything as they age. It's just they're going to become typically less open to experience as we age. We're more stable. It's just there's also a stable trend to kind of revert back to the mean, or I guess become less neurotic and less open to experience as we age. But we also become more agreeable and conscientious as we age as well. In fact, we become more agreeable throughout our entire life, and we become more conscientious in middle age in particular as we age. And that kind of dramatic change in childhood and that consistent shift in adulthood tells us that traits might not be what we define them to be, consistent across age and across personality. What we also see with traits is that there's a very little amount of stability across generations. So when we compare one group of individuals to the next, what we often see is that one particular cohort or one particular age group typically has kind of an overarching difference between another cohort. So elderly individuals, if we compare our grandparents to current teenagers, what we often see is that those elderly individuals in our current society were very, very close to experience, so very low on openness to experience, and typically a little bit less agreeable and less conscientious than our current society. Today's society is much more open to experience, but also much more neurotic than past generations as well. And those differences that we see are differences that are there at the exact same age. So teenagers, 60 years ago, had very different personality characteristics than teenagers nowadays, at least on average. So there might be those changes. There might be those trends for us to become less neurotic, less open to experience. But there's also kind of major social factors, major generational factors that seem to trigger different types of personality. So when we think about our grandparents, what we can also usually see is that their environment was very different from ours. Okay, a lot of them experienced the Great Depression, and a lot of experienced wars and other things, and those things shaped their enduring characteristics, their traits, in a way that we didn't experience in some of the newer generations. All right. Another thing that we see with this idea of developments and traits is that even though we assume they're consistent, the number of traits that we can use to define people actually changes. In fact, what we see when we look at different age groups is that the Big Five doesn't really work for specific groups. And one of the first groups that we see a major difference in is in children. In particular, what they see is that they should probably have or be measured in something called the Big Seven. Because children not only have the Big Five that causes them to be different from each other, but they also have two characteristics that don't really fit into the Big Five, called sociability and activity. So children are either extremely active or extremely sedate, or somewhere in between when they're children, and they're also either very talkative, sociable, or they're very kind of aloof. They don't interact with people, and they just kind of do their thing. And these two factors, sociability and activity, don't really emerge in adulthood. In fact, they kind of just get swallowed up when we get into adulthood. But in childhood, we see some very different behaviors that don't really pair up with the Big Five. And one classic study that allowed us to recognize this was one that was actually fairly ingenious, called the Harry Potter study. So I don't know if any of you were a part of the Harry Potter craze about a decade ago when it first came out. But the Harry Potter craze, when it first started, allowed researchers to use a very ingenious tool to get at a lot of people's personalities. So there's actually a researcher at Berkeley who came up with a website that allowed people to see which Harry Potter character their child was most like. And what this gave these researchers was a huge sample of participants that essentially gave them personality descriptor responses. And from the millions and millions of people that responded to this study, the researchers were able to show with very conclusive evidence that sociability and activity did not really meld with the other Big Five. Another thing, though, that we see is not only do children not really fit in with the Big Five very well, but elderly seem to also kind of differ in the Big Five. In fact, what we see when we do factor analyses with the elderly is that oftentimes a lot of these terms, agreeableness and conscientiousness in particular, and neuroticism and an openness to experience also, tend to merge into just three factors. So instead of having agreeableness and conscientiousness as two distinct personality characteristics when we get older, they usually kind of overlap with each other. So if we're high in one, we're almost always high in the other. If we're low in one, we're almost always low in the other. If we're in the middle with one, we're almost always in the middle with the other. And this has caused a lot of researchers to propose that we should be calling it the Big Three when we look at the elderly individuals. And all of these changes, all of these trends, tell us that even though personality is something that we define as being consistent, it's something that definitely is not nearly as consistent as we think, and that development also plays a major role in how we can measure personality and how we measure the major aspect of personality that we're often interested in, and that's this concept of traits. Another thing we see with traits and personality is that even though we see very specific trends in where our personality develops, where our identity develops, and where our sense of self develops, one big thing that throws a huge wrench in this whole idea of development and this whole concept of a consistent pattern of growth is the major life events that can have a huge impact on our sense of self and all of the subcomponents of the self. In essence, when a person encounters a major loss or a major positive experience, all of the things related to growth, development, and this sense of identity and self can be thrown out the window. Consistency is found in these trends because we're measuring very large samples of people, and we're measuring them over a very long period of time. But within each individual, those life experiences, those encounters, those major traumatic experiences in particular, are what seems to really shape our sense of identity, our sense of personality, and our overarching sense of self. So, before we close today, I want you to appreciate the notion that our personalities, our identities, and our sense of self do typically follow a very steady pattern. If any of you are sitting there in class right now, or sitting at home obviously, right now, listening to this and thinking, I don't fit into this category, my sense of identity has changed dramatically because of this or that, well, you're one of those people that doesn't fit the norm. It doesn't fit the statistical pattern because you're one of those individuals that's had a life event probably that really alters this predictable pattern that we typically describe when summing up the concept of self. When reviewing today, just kind of a brief summary, remember that in the first half of today's class we talked about this idea of self, coming up with who we are, and coming up with a way to actually define who you are on that blind date and across multiple situations throughout of your life. And we talked about the fact that this idea of self is something that's evolving due to kind of changes in our experience, changes in our focus, and life events that really do alter the way we perceive ourselves. But within the self, there's two major aspects that we get to focus on in the second half of today's class, and that's the sense of identity and the sense of personality that really do encapsulate a large portion of this overarching idea of the self. And as we saw with both identity and personality, development stages in our life have a huge impact on how we can look at identity and personality over time. Well, that marks the end of this class. In the next class we're going to be moving on to a slightly more controversial topic than we've been discussing so far, and that's the concept of gender and sexual identity. Now, this particular area definitely falls under the umbrella of social and emotional development, but it's one that's been mired in controversy occasionally over the years because of the topic that it actually addresses. Please, when you're listening to the slides and reading the chapter for this section, try to keep an open mind, and remember, we're trying to study this particular area from a scientific standpoint, not from a policy standpoint. Also, in addition to starting to get ready for that last class, the next big thing that you have to start thinking about is that second paper. It's already posted if you want to start working on it, but even if you're not working on writing about it, you really start to think about how you're going to design your paper, maybe what you want to put in there, because this last paper and last exam are coming up very, very quickly. Hope you all enjoyed today. Best of luck to all of you, and I will see you all soon.